I'm going to start this video off by explaining exactly why I feel this topic is necessary to discuss right now. Shadow of the Erdtree just came out, and I've seen nothing but some of the most volatile and divisive discourse over that DLC. I, like everyone else, absolutely have some of my own opinions on it, but you all know what this video will be about at this point, so as you may have figured, I don't really plan on discussing Shadow of the Erdtree right now. To be quite honest, even the thought of talking about it at length really exhausts me, and I don't even necessarily find that it's due to the DLC itself. There are so many factors that you have to take into account when you're trying to break it down, because while it is, objectively speaking, pretty good, I find that there's one question which pesters me whenever I decide to think about it. And that question is, where do you go from here? I really like Elden Ring as a standalone experience, but part of me struggles to see how it would work as a series at this point. Since day one, it has constantly reminded me of the benefits Fromsoftware's more linear game design offered them, and many of these features would be sorely missed if they were to never return again except through the rare offshoot experience. Now, with me fixating on this idea over the past few weeks, I thought it could be fun to discuss exactly what made one of their older titles so special to me. So, instead of talking about Elden Ring for the time being, I've decided to make this video in dedication to what remains my favorite Fromsoftware game to date. At this point, I think it's time for a brief history lesson. The first Dark Souls was the result of a development team getting near complete creative control over the project they were working on. It's really sad to say, but very few games have ever been permitted this type of creative freedom. And in this case, it was FromSoftware's previous, albeit unexpected, success story that allowed them this luxury. Demon's Souls was a massive creative risk, and it's pretty much the sole reason for the studio's current popularity. The game refused to cater to new players through intentionally de-emphasizing its narrative, while also having many deliberately infuriating fights throughout the experience. It was hard to digest, and unlike most other fantasy titles from 2009, Demon's Souls happened to be extremely dark in its fantastical setting, and this ended up creating an experience which stood out both thematically and mechanically. It's a game whose sole purpose was to evoke the player's sense of exploration and creativity, while only guiding them with a loose feeling of forward momentum throughout this process. You, as the player, choose where to go, who to fight, and how to build your character at any moment in this game, and all while having little to no help on exactly how to do this. The general lack of any guidance offered by Demon's Souls facilitated an extremely freeing experience, and one which was, and still is, very rewarding to progress through. In this sense, Demon's Souls walked so Dark Souls could run, as Dark Souls found almost all of its success through doubling down on everything that made its predecessor so unique and interesting. The funny part is that nobody really expected Demon's Souls to be a success at all. Rather infamously at this point, the then president of Sony Entertainment stated that Demon's Souls was a shockingly terrible game after he couldn't get past the first level, and this was the man who funded the damn experience. While he later came to admit that this was a colossal mistake, at the time, he somewhat refused to support FromSoftware's future endeavors, while also passing on any potential stake within the company. With this, Sony's initial rejection of this game absolutely impeded its launch sales, but in the end, it may have also unintentionally provided FromSoft with the means to create Dark Souls down the road. Let me explain. Sony wanted to publish an easily marketable fantasy game that reached a consistently high bar of quality. So, not really Demon's Souls. And with Sony asleep at the wheel, this game was exclusively released in Japan to essentially no fanfare. It was only after this game was re-released in America where things took off for it. And due to this title being a pretty big success in the West, a sequel in all but name was funded by Bandai Namco not too long after Sony's immense displeasure with Demon's Souls. I just said a sequel in all but name for a reason. Sony owned the rights to the Demon's Souls IP, and while FromSoft clearly wanted to continue down the path they had already set out for themselves, they were unable to create a direct successor due to licensing agreements. And that's essentially the whole story. The unexpected success that was Demon's Souls allowed for Miyazaki, the lead designer behind these games, to double down on everything that made it so offbeat and interesting for their follow-up experience. They were going to create a title which evoked even more agency in the player, giving them much more control over what they decided to do at any moment relative to its predecessor. They dropped the level-based format of Demon's Souls in favor of a pseudo-open world, and this would end up facilitating a much deeper connection to the game's environments for the player. Now, with that Demon Souls 2 name being off the table, what were they gonna call this game? I got 2 words for you. Dark Ring. As it turns out, Fromsoftware didn't particularly want their new game's title to be mistaken for some British slang for a certain anatomical region, so they ended up calling it Dark Souls instead. And with this, one of the most revered titles of all time, especially by myself, was set to be released during the September of 2011. Now, I think it's about time to dive into Dark Souls itself. There is so much I want to discuss about this game, but first, I would like to disclose where I'm coming from as a fan of this title. Just like the many others who love it, I find that I have a quite deep emotional connection with Dark Souls, one which is somewhat difficult to fully explain. The obtuse nature of this experience allowed for me, and the many others who love this title, to fill in the blanks between this game's world and narrative, and I feel like in doing so, we all left a bit of ourselves within it. I didn't end up playing Demon Souls until much later, and my playthrough of this game was extremely blind. For this reason, I find that no words can exactly describe the emotional roller coaster which was initially reaching Firelink Shrine, or Anne Orlando, or even defeating something as simple as the Bell Gargoyles. I have a long history with video games, and almost felt like Dark Souls knew that and tried to use it to its advantage. Me having skipped over Demon Souls most likely emphasized this, but it seemed like this game was constantly trying to subvert any expectations I had prior to the experience. While I knew it took influence from many other well-regarded titles which I had played, I wasn't at all prepared for how much this game would absolutely rock my world. To put it figuratively, every time I thought this game was going to go right, it went left. I knew that this game would be difficult, and when I started the experience, I actually thought it was trying to rage bait me for like the first 10 hours or so. But then it just decides to create some of the most emotional moments I've ever experienced within a video game right afterwards, and usually without even needing a single word to do so. Dark Souls lives on the emotional extremes, as at times, it can make you want to throw your controller through the damn TV, while at others, it tries its best to reduce the player to tears. It's this dichotomy that allows for it to feel so special. You can't reach any of the emotional summits in this game without having to trudge through the mud first. And quite similarly, you'll have to kill hundreds of mindless ghouls before you get anywhere near being able to fight a god. It's this power fantasy that adds so beautifully to the experience. This isn't Skyrim. You don't start as the Dragonborn hero that is destined to stop Alduin. To put it as simply as possible, you literally start as a debilitated and imprisoned zombie with absolutely no loot or skills to speak of. I mean, like, how do you really get much lower than that? Your character would be the Dragonborn's early game fodder, and in this sense, Dark Souls effectively acts as the counter to everything which something like the Elder Scrolls stands for. You aren't given the moniker of the Chosen One by the Emperor at the very beginning of the game. No, you're gonna have to earn that title. This just about covers all the thematic bases I wanted to introduce at the start of this video, but Dark Souls still has so much under its hood. And at this point, I want to discuss what is likely the elephant in the room. Mechanically, Dark Souls always tries its best to disenfranchise the player through its difficulty, and this forces us to somewhat elevate our playstyle in order to get the most out of this experience. You may have heard phrases like "get good" or "the Dark Souls of blank" in the past, and generally speaking, that's because this game is culturally synonymous with difficulty. Now, I'm not going to state that this game is easy or even fair at all times, but what I will say is that its difficulty can be largely overemphasized. Don't get me wrong, it still has one of the highest learning curves of any single player game I have ever experienced, but that curve plateaus while the tools that the game gives you continuously get better and better. This title's difficulty very much so hinges on the player's ability to deal with adversity and learn from their mistakes. And if you ask me, I kind of think that's how difficulty should be implemented in a game. Have you learned the attack patterns of the enemies you're fighting? Are you aware of when you're impervious to damage during your dodge rolls? And have you optimized your weapons and armor for each fight? These are all questions you may find yourself asking every single time you reach a milestone within this game. And trust me when I say that Dark Souls will absolutely stop the player in their tracks if they haven't. Just as a quick example, I may have died to the renowned Ornstein and Smough like 50 times, but I also had a friend who killed him on his very first try. The difficulty of this experience completely hinges on how your playstyle matures prior to these roadblock moments, and this is why my friend was able to have a significantly easier time than me during this fight. To put it as simply as possible, he just better understood the game. I, on the other hand, was forced to mature in order to beat these guys, and damn, that maturation process was probably the most gratifying aspect of this title for me, and not many experiences I've played recently have matched it. No game I've ever played within this medium has ever matched that elation I felt when beating Ornstein and Smo for the first time. And shockingly, there are several other moments from this game that happen to elicit a very similar response from me. To put it honestly, this game's difficulty always found a way to push me to my absolute limits as a player, and I found that through doing so, it deepened my connection to the experience itself. Just to acknowledge a common criticism for this aspect of the experience, at times, Dark Souls has been historically represented as unfair by many critics of this game. And while I would love to blow smoke up Miyazaki's Dark Ring for hours, I can actually find myself agreeing with this assessment at times. For every Anne Orlando, there is also a Tomb of the Giants waiting around the corner. And while I do believe that the highs drastically outweigh the lows of this experience, I won't pretend like those lows don't exist. For example, I could write an entire damn thesis paper pertaining to why the Bed of Chaos may potentially be one of the worst designed boss encounters I have ever experienced. And just as easily, I could probably write the same damn paper on the Capra Demon. Dark Souls loses its balance at times, and if I didn't acknowledge that the quality and fairness of this game can be a bit all over the place, what kind of video would this be? I wish that some of these moments were better, but I can also state that they never once detracted from my overall experience with this title as a whole. This game always has so many individual variables working harmoniously to make it as fair as possible, and the way that these systems interact with each other is what makes the experience so special. People love to paint a picture of the player being stuck on a boss fight and needing to go kill mobs for hours in order to overcome the challenge. But while you could do this, the game also implements several other methods for the player to overcome each obstacle that don't require senseless grinding. Sure, leveling up does make this game easier, but finding resources that strengthen your armaments, changing builds, learning attack patterns, or even trying to parry certain enemies could also give you the needed edge to defeat each boss. You could also decide to go complete some side content if you're really struggling on that main path, and this will effectively act as both a means to level you up as well as a tool for you to increase your mechanical skill within this game. On top of this, if you really need to, you could always summon other players or NPCs to help with the larger, more difficult bosses. All of this being said, if you try to tackle this game by farming levels or brute forcing your victories, then yeah, you're probably going to have an atrocious experience. But if you take time to understand why you're losing and how to further your playstyle, then you'll probably start to love how all of the systems within this game interact with each other. For this same reason, you can see people beating this game at soul level 1 in under 25 minutes. It's because this game isn't that hard. You just need to get to a point where you understand how to make it easy. Fighting will very easily turn into a rhythm game of dodging while patiently waiting for windows to apply damage. And in this sense, Dark Souls always felt relatively fair. And it's for this same reason that if you've ever played any other FromSoft game, playing Dark Souls will most likely prove to be an absolute cakewalk. The combat systems between each of their games don't actually change all that much, except for Sekiro of course. But as I've already said, this was my first experience with a FromSoft game, so I definitely had quite the steep uphill battle throughout my time with it. On the upside though, this did make the game feel incredibly rewarding to go through. In fact, every time I saw a bonfire in this game, I pretty much had a profoundly spiritual moment. And almost no other game has come close to reaching the emotional peaks I had throughout this experience. The gameplay in Dark Souls is incredibly special, but as I stated earlier, this title still has so much more going for it. Narratively, this game's awesome, but to be quite honest, it's also obscure and quite difficult to fully understand without doing some extra homework. For this same reason, I could somewhat understand why somebody would be entirely disinterested in the lore of this game. I, however, loved it. Dark Souls has some extremely iconic villains, which very few fantasy properties, let alone fantasy games, have ever come close to achieving. And even though it's difficult to fully understand some of these characters' motivations through a single playthrough of this game, I found that the holes in my understanding created mystique around each character, which made them all far more compelling. I got to the point where I was actively looking around for information regarding the characters in Dark Souls, and for this, there were YouTube channels and authors who had dedicated their entire careers to breaking down this title. Creators like VatiVidya have made this game's narrative fully accessible to anybody with a Wi-Fi connection and a couple minutes to spare. And I would even go as far as to state that his videos or some sort of analog act as a massive part of the Dark Souls experience. For this same reason, I don't really intend to break down too much of this game's story, because to be fully honest, there are existing videos which do a far better job of explaining the narrative than I ever could. What I will say is that this game's story remains particularly interested in the idea of cycles and the transition of power. And with this, it's rather fitting that this whole game is essentially you building up your character to dethrone the gods of Lordran. It's a power fantasy that, yet again, I'm definitely there for. At this point, I would most likely say that if you intend to play this game and haven't already, you should probably stop watching this video. I will essentially be spoiling many of this game's best moments, and a blind playthrough of Dark Souls definitely results in the best experience. To be fair, I feel that most of the people who have made it to this point have either already played it or have little to no interest in doing so. So I won't dwell on it, but just as a TLDR for those who will be clicking off, play this game. It's definitely worth it, especially if you've never played one of FromSoft's games before. You absolutely will not regret it. Now, to continue the video. I won't cover every boss and their significance for the sake of all of our time, but what I will say is that the first half of this game somewhat acts as a tutorial for what is the true objective of Dark Souls. The player must make their way from the Undead Asylum to the capital city of Anor Londo, and during this process, they will commit to several smaller objectives while continuing to build up their arsenal and skill set. There are a few roadblock moments during the first half of this game, but none of which compare to the ones you experience later on in this title. What the first 15 hours or so do incredibly well is that it sets the tone of this game while making Lordran feel lived in and huge. I know this example has been brought up several times before, but the genuine amazement I felt when I came back to Firelink Shrine after Undead Burg was incredible. And then the game somehow does the same damn thing when going through New Londo ruins to elicit an even stronger reaction from the player. It seems like it would be easy to make a world feel fluid and logically designed, while still naturally connecting to itself in interesting ways. But I've never really noticed this level of interconnectivity from a non-FromSoft game. Actually, to be quite honest, Dark Souls 1 still does this best to this day, and this is even after considering its successors. This component of the game contributes to why it felt so huge, but in reality, it actually isn't even that big. As I said earlier, this game world feels very lived in, and this gives the player the feeling of it being much larger than it actually is. The funny part is that anybody who's played this title before would know that it's mainly a post-apocalyptic experience, with really no more than a handful of NPCs that actually talk to you. And somehow, Lordran still feels way more inhabited than games with whole cities to explore. Every time you visit a region, you get the feeling that something important had once happened there. And even though the world is dilapidated and empty of any real inhabited regions, you always find yourself incredibly interested to its contents. I had so many questions I constantly thought about throughout my time with Dark Souls. Like, what was New Londo supposed to be before it became ruins? What the hell is Ash Lake? And what happened to Anor Londo? These are all questions which I consistently asked myself throughout my time with this game. And I'm sure that most other players were overwhelmed by similar thoughts when exploring this game's world. Everything in Lordran gives me the feeling that it tries its best to make sense in the greater context of a kingdom. And this allows for each region to feel far more interesting. That's why I can't stop thinking about this crumbled gate, or a dilapidated city. Speaking of, Anor Londo, the capital of this world, is most likely the fan-favorite region from this game, and it's probably one of my personal favorite areas in all of gaming. It's here where you will get to contend with what is probably one of the most well-known boss fights of all time, Orenstein and Smo. These guys are essentially the royal guard protecting the primary antagonist Gwyn and his family, and after you beat them, the floodgates are open for you to challenge the gods of this world. Gravelord Nito, the Four Kings, Seath the Scaleless, the Bed of Chaos, and finally, Gwyn himself. These enemies effectively act as the second half of this game, and while there are still several other side paths the player will be exploring during this portion of the experience, every playthrough will reach the point where they have to overcome these main obstacles. I found each lord visually stunning and incredibly unique to fight. And even though the four lords you fight before Gwyn may represent the worst aspects of this game from a gameplay perspective, I still found that aesthetically and narratively, they are all incredibly compelling. But holy shit! Lost Izalith, the Tomb of the Giants, Crystal Cave, and New Londo Ruins are some of my least favorite regions from this game, and I've already pitched my 2 cents on the Bed of Chaos. To be quite honest, these moments should have been better, and this game's creative freedom came at a cost when the title ended up being rushed out the door before its completion. FromSoft's ambitions were clearly too large for their budget, and the latter half of this game is what suffered. What we got is a little sad to think about when stacked up with what we could have received. Lost Izalith is truly a mess, and Tomb of the Giants is probably my least favorite region from any game. Like, look at it. However, does this ruin the experience for me? No, not even a bit. And I would have definitely felt a lot worse about it if this game hadn't absolutely stuck the landing. I said earlier that Anor Londo is probably one of the best areas in any game, but personally, the Kiln of the First Flame absolutely tops it. Actually, not only is this my favorite region in Dark Souls, but it's also my favorite area in any game, and it achieves this even though there's almost nothing to do in the area. While only having like 5 enemies and a single boss, I still found that it was the Kiln which ended up being the area I thought about long after I beat this game. It's really hard to explain why this is the case, but to do so, I would like to call back to Ornstein and Smough for a second. When you fight them, it feels like you have to kill them, as if it were the emotional summit of this game up to that point. And when you finally beat them, you feel fantastic, like you've killed a god. But, in the end, they aren't gods. Now, considering that this whole game continuously hypes you up for a fight with what is effectively the Zeus of this world, a god who casts lightning bolts and kills dragons, you would expect this fight to feel even more triumphant than Ornstein and Smough. But then you get there, and you end up fighting what is maybe the saddest corpse of a being in this sad corpse of a region. A fallen king who doesn't even get a cutscene before you fight him. All you get are some truly iconic piano chords, which make it as clear as possible. You should almost feel bad for killing him. And this pretty much tells you all you need to know. You have come all this way to kill what is maybe the saddest organism in all of Lordran. This man is absolutely pitiful, and he acts as your final monumental challenge for this experience. Is he the hardest boss? Not particularly, but he is my favorite boss. No other boss in this game has made me feel so conflicted when fighting them, and Gwyn does so while residing in some dust bowl at the heart of Lordran. This is why the Kiln is the best area. It is easily the most unique region in a game where every area feels extremely distinct and carries such a strong identity. And that's it. This ties up this game with a bow. This is why you should care. Not because this game is just good, but because it's so good while consistently trying to get the player to feel something. It's rough around the edges, and I understand that it may not be for everyone, but for this reason alone, it's absolutely for me. Just to wrap up this video, the DLC of this game, it's fantastic, just like every other Fromsoftware DLC. It has some of the best bosses in the series, while also having some visually beautiful, albeit somewhat annoying areas to move through. You get to meet Artorias of the Abyss, a boss that was essentially hyped up throughout the entirety of the base game, and he's fantastic. On top of this, you also get to challenge Manus, one of my personal favorite bosses throughout the Dark Souls series. This DLC acts as the cherry on top of what is one of the best gaming experiences I've ever gone through, and it's practically essential for everyone who plays this game to go through it as well. Just make sure you beat this DLC before you fight Gwyn. You don't want to have to replay the entire game in order to experience the extra content. And that's it. The first Dark Souls is one of the most significant gaming experiences I've ever played, and I'm incredibly happy that I finally got to discuss this game. I've been thinking about it pretty much non-stop while playing Shadow of the Erdtree, and while Elden Ring is a great game, I do miss many of the nuances that made Dark Souls so special. It's a game that found a way to say a lot without needing many words to do so, and while it isn't the largest game ever, especially when compared to Elden Ring, I found that it felt massive in a very different way. It has what I believe to be the strongest identity out of any Fromsoftware experience, and all of the bosses feel fair and fun for the most part. While there are flaws within the experience, and while I do wish some things were better, it makes up for it by having maybe the most heart out of any FromSoft game to date. And that is why it's the best FromSoftware game in my opinion. At the very beginning, I stated that now was the best time to make this video, and I have a more personal anecdote as to why this is the case. I just recently experienced the 1-year anniversary of my channel, and over this past year of drafting and creating these videos, I feel as if I've slowly been building up my skill set to the point where I can finally talk about many of the games which have, in a way, changed me and my perspective on games as a whole. I've already tested the water a couple of times through making videos on a few of the titles which have left some sort of emotional impact on me, but there are some games which I've been holding on to for a time where I'd be able to fully express just how much that experience meant to me. Dark Souls is very easily a top 5 game to me, and to put it quite simply, I think everybody should play it. I definitely plan on making videos on other FromSoft games in the future, and while a video on Dark Souls 2 or Elden Ring may not be out incredibly soon, I mean like they are 50-hour experiences, I wouldn't be surprised if I decided to drop these at some point in the future. So, if you're interested, consider subscribing. I would like to thank everybody who took the time out of their day to watch this video, as even talking about this game somewhat allows for me to relive that Dark Souls experience in a way. And I hope that you enjoyed what was essentially just me venting. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all soon.